Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer,
And I'm Christa Carmen,
and this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and Gentlemen, welcome back to part 2 of PEE WEE Gaskins. Last week, we told you the story of PEE WEE Gaskins as told to James Beaty, an English professor and devout Christian hired by Pee Wee's lawyer to write his life story. Knowing that Beaty wanted to write a book of redemption, Gaskins told him he'd killed only out of necessity, never murdered anyone that didn't need killing. He told him that he'd never been a rapist, had never raped a single person. But now we are going to take a look at the book, Final Truth, which Pee Wee wrote with writer Wilton Earl, which tells a very different story. Some of the contradictions completely bizarre and very revealing. As we sift through what nuggets of truth we can and study the nature of the many lies, we will try to understand this monster of a man. Ladies and gentlemen, strap in. This is a doozy. One hell of a ride. I mean that most sincerely. Get ready as we present to you Pee Wee Gaskins Part 2, The Final Truth.
Let's begin. Prologue, a series of inconvenient truths. We don't often use trigger warnings on this show. I mean, if you're listening to a true crime podcast called Murder Coaster, we're going to assume you know what kind of ride you stepped into. The name itself is a trigger warning of sorts. We've covered cannibals, necrophiles, read the infamous Albert Fish letter about Grace Budd, detailed the heinous crimes of the Night Stalker, talked about nasty people of all sorts. But guess what? Today, we're issuing a trigger warning, as the supposed nonfiction autobiography of Pee Wee Gaskins, Final Truth, is one of the most disturbing, twisted, disgusting, and vile things ever put into print. Much of it is thought to be fictional, written just to shock, but other parts are disturbingly very, very true, and more heinous than you can ever believe. So, trigger warning, folks, as we're going to go over in detail, as even the parts that are believed to be false and fabricated still give insight into one of the most evilly clever, diabolical, and savagely twisted minds in the history of true crime.
So what is truth in this story and what is fiction? Well, we have 3 sources we're using. We have the trial transcripts of Pee Wee's testimony. We have what Pee Wee told James Beaty for his unpublished book, Pee Wee and Me. And we have the supposed autobiography, Final Truth.
There are some elements that we can definitely prove as truth or lies, but others you'll have to discern for yourself. For Pee Wee Gaskins was a master deceiver. As he says,
I talk to everybody different, depending on who they are and what I want from them. I got a special way to talk to guards and prison officials to try to manipulate them into doing what I want. I talk one way to inmates that can do something for me and another to those who can't. I got special sets of words I use with preachers to let them know how much Jesus means to me. And I try to get them to sneak me in something special to eat, some contraband that I can use. And got still another way of talking to family. It's like kind of the definition of a psychopath personality right there. And then just to add to all the confusion about what's real and what's not real in the book, Final Truth, there's barely anything out there about this writer, Wilton Earl. Google Books has only this to say about him.
Author-journalist Wilton Earle spent 15 months listening to Gaskin's horrific confessions, and here reveals insight into a killer's tortured mind. This graphic account is not recommended for young readers, but should be required reading for all law enforcement personnel, attorneys, sociologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, and anyone in the forensic field.
And yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this book definitely does not need to be required reading for anyone, anywhere. It's pretty much a bunch of hogwash, and we read it, so you listeners don't have to. But as far as this author and journalist, Wilton Earle, there's no bio or even a photo on his Amazon or Goodreads page. No website, nothing. And he's supposed to have been a journalist, but I can't find a single article or magazine, newspaper, or publication he's ever written for. I found one tiny tidbit of an interview he gave to PBS when Final Truth was released, but it's really only seconds long.
He did write two other books, one called Mance, about a famous Confederate soldier in the Civil War, and another book called Terralyn, but both are out of print.
Yeah, and the book Terralyn is about a girl named Terralyn Wagger, who he claims killed 9 people before her 15th birthday, including her parents. But I can't find anything about her at all. Nada. He claims that all court records were sealed and she was released on her 18th birthday, changed her name, and went into hiding. And full disclaimer, I have not read the book, but you'd think there'd be something on the internet, some article of some sort about these killings. I mean, I don't know if anyone has information on it, email us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We always want information on things.
Okay, and with these inconvenient truths now out of the way, let's take a look at the book, Final Truth.
Chapter 1: Separate Truths. For the early part of his life, Pee Wee tells Wilton Earle pretty much the same thing he told James Beaty, that his mother had been just 15 when she birthed him, and that he was raised with horrific abuse by his stepfathers and step-siblings, and that from a very young age, he was on his own, repairing cars and fixing appliances for money before he was even a teenager.
But according to true crime author Marilyn Bardsley, none of this was true, not even the age at which she had Pee Wee, saying she was actually in her 20s. She claims, after talking to numerous family members, that Pee Wee was deeply loved and never beaten, and far from being bullied for his impish looks. He was found adorable and spoiled rotten, able to get away with anything.
But if this is true, why hadn't Pee Wee's mother told James Beaty that when he was writing Pee Wee and Me? Had she just wanted to go along with Pee Wee's tall tales? Or perhaps Beaty, who found Pee Wee's mother a sensitive, demure churchgoer, didn't want to get into the details with her and upset her. I don't know. I want to believe everything James Beaty says. I mean, he's got a PhD in English literature, was a respected college professor. Even he admits that he lied to investigators at one point.
And while Pee Wee claims he was badly bullied and beaten in school, Marilyn Bardsley says she interviewed some of his elementary school teachers, and they deny that he was bullied or beaten. But they say he was a deeply troubled child who enjoyed torturing animals, regularly ripping the legs off of frogs, and once finding a bird's nest and killing each tiny bird. And though he wasn't bullied, his odd ways set him apart from the other children and made him an outsider.
So we don't really know, but there's one thing that is beyond question. Pee Wee Gaskins loved the carnival. He was a carny at heart. And also, as James Beaty pointed out, he has a charismatic and entrancing way of telling a story. And we can glean an understanding of his psychology from his stories in Final Truth, regardless of how fact-based they are. And as for the carnival, he says, in his signature country twang and euphemisms, most of what I remember from when I was real young is hazy, like trying to see through smoke in the woods. But I do have one memory that's as clear as yesterday, going to the carnival. It was about 1937, I would guess. And I remember the barker saying something like, "Ladies and gentlemen, let me direct your attention to the center of the tent. The snake lying inside may look peaceful, but don't be fooled. You are looking at the most dangerous creature on God's earth. That is the fearsome king cobra."
The carnival barker, or talker, for as we've said before, they don't like being called barkers.
Don't call him a barker.
Right? The carnival talker explained how the cobra had just eaten, that you could still see the bulge in the snake from its last meal, but that if he put a rat in the cage, the snake would kill it for no other reason than the thrill of the kill. And sure enough, when the barker dropped a rat in the cage, the snake lunged and struck, sinking its fangs into the rodent for no reason at all, and then just went to sleep. And it is this, Pee Wee says, that awoke his first sexual impulses, death and fear. As he says,
I looked at my reflection, then at the cobra, and I turned and saw my cousin a-trembling and holding tight to my mama's leg. And I looked at my mama's and my stepdaddy's faces and saw that they were scared as well. But I had a hard-on, and I knew that what I had just seen was somehow special and important. I still carry that memory clear as a picture etched in my brain. Nothing they do to me can ever burn it away.
So, though we can't know how many of his stories are true, we can see that from a very young age, he's equating death and fear, and the power that death and fear hold with sex.
And like he told James Beaty, in Final Truth, Pee Wee says that by the age of 10, he had a gift as a mechanic and quit school to work at a filling station. And he describes meeting some other kids and starting a little gang of sorts. And while he describes this time to Mr. Jim as an innocent period, like something out of the Little Rascals, he tells Wilton Earl that it was then that he learned from the other boys to, quote, "fuck a sheep or goat or chicken."
He and his friends, Danny and Marsh, who called themselves the Trouble Trio, hung out in an abandoned house they called the Hideout. They engaged in homosexual acts with each other and other younger children. And for kicks, they hid in latrines and watched women come to relieve themselves. They broke into vending machines and stole money and cigarettes, then started breaking into houses, Danny's father fencing the stolen goods for the children.
Remember, Pee Wee Gaskins had told Mr. Jim that he'd never raped anyone, emphasized it on their first visit together. He said it was important for him to set the record straight on that point. Yet, he told Wilton Earl that he committed his first rape at 12 years old, when he and his gang abducted Marsh's little sister, took her to the Hideout, raped and sodomized her, forcing her to perform oral sex on all of them, while she cried and begged them to stop.
The young girl told her parents, and Pee Wee and his friends were taken to a barn, stripped naked and hung upside down by their feet from a rafter, and beat with a pine board and a belt. In Final Truth, Pee Wee describes being strung up by his ankles and beaten as such.
I felt the pine board splitting my butt. Pain was all in my back and legs. My ass had already went numb. I was just about to pass out when I suddenly heard Marsh's mama scream,
"You goddamn little piece of shit, out to cut it off right here and now."
and I realized that I had a hard on. She didn't cut it off, but she did take the belt from my stepdaddy, and she strapped my dick and balls until I thought sure they would be useless to me for the rest of my life.
This incident appears to be very true and caused such a scandal in the little town that both Danny and Marsh's families moved away to avoid the shame.
Now, remember last week how one of the first things Pee Wee told Mr. Jim was that the first time he was sent to reform school, he'd been completely innocent. That he was just an innocent little boy sent away for a crime he didn't commit. Well, he tells a much different story in Final Truth. Here he says he was breaking into a house that he thought was empty, and in the act of burglarizing it, he was suddenly confronted by a young girl with an axe. She swung at him. He managed to get that axe away from her and beat her unconscious, leaving her there for dead.
He was charged with assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill and sentenced to the South Carolina Industrial School for White Boys until the time of his 18th birthday. And it's here where he says his real education was about to begin.
Chapter 2: The Industrial School for White Boys. The second day at the school, Pee Wee was attacked in the showers by a 6-foot-tall guy named Poss, and 5 of his friends held Pee Wee down as he was gang raped by 20 boys. Afterwards, he was unable to walk and had to be carried back to his bed. As he saw it, he had 3 options at that point. He could report the assault, he would be put in protective custody, which was solitary, locked in a dark, dank room for 24 hours a day with no running water or toilet, just a bucket. Or he could get gang raped every day. And the final option was to become Poss's personal slave. He chose the latter.
Apparently, Poss came to really like Pee Wee, who'd regale him with stories and fixed a radio for him. Sometimes Poss, who went by Boss Poss Hoss, would give Pee Wee a boy to rape, but sometimes Poss would give Pee Wee out to the other inmates he owed a favor to, sometimes selling him for cigarettes. It was an unimaginably brutal world. As Pee Wee says,
I never knew when I was going to be told to go somewhere and strip or blow or ream or get reamed or whatever by whoever Poss had made another deal with. Things was just too rough, so I started making plans to run away.
He made a run for it and was able to make it back to the hideout, the abandoned house he and the Trouble Trio would meet in. But police were aware of this place and quickly tracked him down. He was given 30 lashes and assigned 3 months of isolated hard labor. All day he would dig trenches, 4 feet wide by 4 feet deep, 100 feet long in the heat, the rain, the cold, every day, all day. And when he'd finish a trench, he'd have to go back and fill it back in and then go start a new one.
Eventually, he was put back in the hell of the dormitories where Poss took possession of him again, using him as he wished and lending him out to be assaulted by other boys for cigarettes and favors. And again, Pee Wee made a break for it, this time lasting only 6 days. When he returned, Poss was gone, but he'd been replaced by an even more savage leader who loved to watch Pee Wee being gang raped. So he ran again and again was caught. Again and again he'd run away, get caught, be brought back, eventually being beaten so badly he spent 5 weeks in the hospital of the institution, which was really just a solitary cell that would occasionally have a nurse visit.
When he recovered, he was put back in hard labor, so he immediately escaped again, making it to Sumter, where he ran into none other than Poss.
You'd think finding the man who raped you, sold you, traded you for a pack of cigarettes would be terrifying. But Pee Wee had actually been seeking Poss out because Poss's uncle was a roustabout for the carnival. And Pee Wee dreamed of being in the carnival. And they'd, in fact, get Pee Wee a job helping set up and take down American Amusement's Carnival as it toured across the Southeast.
Pee Wee loved the carnival. He'd been intrigued and fascinated with it since he was a child, and now he was a true blue carny. Then he met his first wife, Mary, the two getting hitched on January 22nd, 1951. But Mary convinced Pee Wee that a life on the run from the law was no kind of life, and he should go finish his sentence.
At this point, he only had 3 months left, and because he returned voluntarily, he wasn't beaten or put into hard labor. He just had to sit in solitary until it was time for his release.
Out of reform school, Pee Wee made a go at an honest life with his wife. They had a daughter, but it was a hard scrabble life. He worked logging cypress in the swamps for very little pay and hated it. And soon Pee Wee found lucrative work as an arsonist, burning down barns so tobacco farmers could make insurance claims.
One day, Pee Wee was working in a tobacco barn, curing leaves, when two teenage girls who lived on the property came in and started teasing him. Pee Wee told them to leave him alone. But when one said he wasn't nothing but scum that deserved to be on the chain gang, Pee Wee hit her in the head with a hammer, saying, "It made a popping sound like wood cracking. Then I smacked her again, this time on top of the head, and she fell to the barn floor and didn't move. So I kicked her in the face, just for good measure."
Pee Wee was sentenced to 5 years for assault, then told the judge,
"Well, fuck you, you old son of a bitch,"
and was given an additional year for contempt.
It's interesting to note that Pee Wee told James Beaty that he'd gone to prison for barn burning, but tells Wilton Earl that it was for a brutal assault on a teenage girl. Just picking and choosing which crime for which biographer.
So Pee Wee was sent to the South Carolina State Penitentiary for the first time, a place he called the dreariest on earth, like a dungeon castle.
Here he was introduced to the world of power men, the prison elders, saying, "They ran the inside of the prison by their own rules, and the guards overlooked the rules they broke because the power men helped them keep order and traded favors with them. Prison was a whole shit pot worse than reform school."
The prison guards basically gave Pee Wee to a huge prisoner named Arthur, who beat and raped him, with Pee Wee saying,
"He was big, and he took a real long time, and it hurt bad. Afterwards, he made me lick him clean. I decided that if I couldn't figure a way to escape, maybe I should try to become a power man. I gave it lots of thoughts, and I reckoned that I needed to come up with an act so goddamn violent that every man in the pen would be scared shitless of me. I had to kill somebody, not just anybody. I had to kill somebody powerful and special."
That man would be Hazel Brazel, the biggest and meanest man in the prison. Pee Wee schemed how to get to him, and eventually was able to deliver a sandwich and soda pop to his cell. Finding the man squatting on the toilet, Pee Wee says,
"I didn't hesitate a lick. I jabbed the knife into his left jugular vein and sliced towards his Adam's apple and twisted it deep in his pulse artery. He tried to yell, but just gurgled. I surprised myself at how calm I was. I didn't really feel nothing much at all. I watched the way the blood spurts got shorter and shorter until finally he slumped sideways and fell off the toilet."
Pee Wee thought Arthur, who basically owned him, would be irate, but instead he hugged him and congratulated him. Pee Wee was now a power man, and he was able to convince prison officials it was self-defense, and only received 3 extra years to his sentence.
But then Pee Wee got word that Mary was going to divorce him, and he was devastated. He became determined to escape, saying, "I knew my chances of escaping was skinny as a coon dick toothpick, but I kept looking." And dude, skinny as a coon dick toothpick? That's some really good vernacular, you gotta say. Have you ever seen a raccoon's penis bone?
No. I can't say that I
Raccoons have a
have.
bone in their penis. I got
That's
one around
wild.
here. Yeah,
Actually,
it
I
is.
feel like you told me that before, but I don't think you showed me the strange actual artifact. So, yeah, hold out for that.
I don't know how many other animals are like that. It's really weird.
That's wild. And in 1953, he was able to hide in a trash barrel, and that was loaded in the prison garbage truck, and he got out.
He was unable to find Mary, but found his old buddy Poss and was back in the carnival circuit again. Traveling with the carnival was also a means of carrying on criminal enterprises for Poss, slipping in and out of towns anonymously, and soon Pee Wee was helping strip down stolen cars and dealing in stolen weapons.
Most of this is verifiable and true, but Pee Wee then ventures into some wild tales that, while we can't verify them or not, sound like some boasting. He claims he hooked up with an exotic dancer from the carnival's girly show named Zena from Zanzibar. She was a contortionist who wowed Pee Wee with her prowess in lovemaking, twisting her body in all sorts of ways, wrapping her ankles behind her neck, and utterly seducing him. He says her real name was Betty Jean, and she was a wanted criminal in 5 states for forgery, larceny, and armed robbery.
Betty Jean had Pee Wee wrapped around her finger and had him deliver a carton of cigarettes to her brother in jail. Only that guy wasn't her brother. He was actually her husband, and hidden in them cigarettes was a razor blade that the guy pulled on the night guard, stealing his keys and escaping jail. Then Betty Jean and her husband ran off, leaving Pee Wee in the lurch.
Now, how much of this is true, who knows? It sure sounds like bullshit. A beautiful exotic dancer and contortionist named Zena Zanzibar who seduced Pee Wee and tricked him into bringing her jailed husband a razor blade. But there's no denying that the FBI picked up Pee Wee and charged him with interstate auto theft and put him in the Atlanta federal prison, where he claims he was befriended by Frank Costello, head of the Genovese mafia family, and his lieutenants.
He learned about omerta or merte, trust and loyalty, or death, a code he'd keep the rest of his life. He says that all the higher-ranking Italian gangsters were given nicknames, and since he already had a nickname, Pee Wee, he was accepted by them. He said having a nickname bestowed one a higher rank in prison. He claims they even asked him to come to New York City and work for them when he got out, but he refused, as he was a good old Southern boy and wanted to stay near his family. Aw, ain't that sweet?
Chapter 3: The Swinging 60s. On August 6, 1961, Donald Pee Wee Gaskins was released from the Atlanta federal prison and was finally a truly free man.
By now, he had a reputation among the criminals of South Carolina. He was a confirmed power man with a nickname. He claims he traveled with a roaming preacher, breaking into houses, stealing cars, and in 1962 was again getting married for the second time, saying, "Her name was Jerry Dolores, and she was fine, even though she was almost 18, which was old by my standards. I enjoyed being with my new wife too, though I was usually restless to leave after a few days."
He then disturbingly details how he raped a 12-year-old named Patsy and was caught when her aunts found the bloody sheets on her bed. Again, describing a life so very different than what he'd told to Jim Beaty. He'd told Jim he never raped anyone, and described himself as a carny playboy of sorts who, through charm and wit, was able to seduce women, fully grown women, while saying in final truth that he was a violent child rapist, saying,
"That was the best piece of virgin ass I ever had."
He was arrested for sexual assault and brought to the courthouse to be arraigned. And when somehow left alone for a moment, leapt out the window, scampering off into the swamps. Pee Wee loved the swamps. Police put bloodhounds on his trail, and when they heard those dogs bang, they thought they had him cornered, only to discover he'd tied the dogs to a tree, had left the swamp, stolen a car, and was on the run again.
After 2 months on the run, he married his third wife, a 17-year-old named Lenny, saying about it, "I told her I loved her and wanted to marry her. It never stops amazing me what a woman will do in exchange for them words. We got married at her family's house and lived together for 3 months before I got so restless I couldn't tolerate it no more. I left and never had no intentions of ever seeing her again."
But after hopping freight trains, stealing cars, and running with the carnival, he was back. Only Lenny, feeling scorned, went a jawing to the police and turned him in. Pee Wee saying,
"When a woman decides to get her revenge, a man might as well bend over and kiss his asshole, dick, and balls goodbye."
He was sentenced to 6 years for rape plus 2 more years for escaping custody.
Pee Wee was sent back to the South Carolina State Penitentiary, which was no longer segregated and actually now had black prison guards. And something truly strange. While Pee Wee had told Jim Beaty that he was a racist, that it was just part of his code and a way of life in the Jim Crow South, something he also echoed during his testimony at trial. In final truth, he claims he was not a racist at all. Why? Why admit to the rape of children, something he vehemently denied to Jim Beaty, but say he wasn't racist, which he most certainly was? Everyone who knew him said he was incredibly racist. It's like beyond dispute. He even testified in court that he was a racist under oath. Why lie at the end? I don't know.
Another big change in the prison was that there were no more power men. New policies no longer permitted inmates to rule other inmates with force, terror, and intimidation. But Pee Wee says,
"The only difference was that things were organized and done quieter, so as not to attract no attention. The warden said the power man didn't exist anymore and that he ran the penitentiary, but all he really controlled was the gates and the walls and the fences that kept us in."
And so Pee Wee Gaskins served out his time, a nickname and secret power man. And in November of 1968, he was released on parole. He was 35 years old.
He became a roofer, trying to appear a legitimate, law-abiding citizen, supplementing his income by stripping and repainting stolen cars. As he said of the time, "I stayed in different places in and around Sumter, with one or more women, usually in nice trailers. Of course, by then they was called mobile homes, which I remembered was what Paul's wife had called their trailer after she had the wheels took off. I recollect how mad she got when Paul said it was still a trailer and said, 'It ain't no trailer, it's a mobile home.' And he said, 'How the fuck can it be a mobile home when it can't go nowhere because it ain't got no wheels?'"
A question for the ages. Chapter 4, The Coastal Killings. For a time, Pee Wee worked at the Campbell's Soup Factory butchering chickens, where Professor James Beaty had also worked, as you may remember from our last episode. And at this point, he got himself a very special knife.
Now, Pee Wee told James Beaty that he stole a butchering knife, and he even called it a Campbell soup knife. and this is what he used in many of his crimes. And in fact, it's also in the courtroom testimony where he again calls it his Campbell soup knife and says it was one piece of stainless steel made to cut through bone so it wasn't going to bend, break, or fall apart. And this knife was actually in evidence right there in the courtroom.
But apparently having to always embellish everything and proving that you can't believe a word this guy ever says, instead of saying it was an industrial boning knife stolen from a chicken processing plant, Pee Wee says this about the knife in Final Truth.
It was a hand-forged fighting knife called a Arkansas toothpick. 11 inches of blade, double-edged like a stiletto, and honed straight, razor sharp. It was purely the biggest, meanest looking knife I ever saw. It was special. In a way, it was as much a part of me as my dick. It surely brought me as much pleasure, and it could kill, which was something I had never been able to do with my dick, no matter how hard I tried.
This is when Pee Wee claims he started his quote-unquote coastal killings and became a serial killer, abducting hitchhikers, torturing them, sexually assaulting them, and murdering them in all sorts of disturbing and devious ways. He says he got a heaviness within him, an anxiety that built and built, forcing him to kill. As he put it,
"First, that heaviness commenced to roll around in my gut, and then up my spine and into my head and down again. I hurt from my balls to behind my eyes. A truly terrible kind of pain that felt like it wanted to tear me open so it could get out. I got edgy and upset and mean as a cottonmouth moccasin in a gallon-sized mason jar."
he says the only way he was able to relieve this anxiety and pain was to rape and murder random strangers, hitchhikers. He claims to have killed upwards of 90 hitchhikers, mostly young women, but some young men as well, and even couples.
But none of these murders have ever been confirmed. Not a single one of them. Authorities can't even find missing persons who resemble his supposed victims. And all of these coastal killings are thought to be completely made up. Why? Why make this claim? I think partly he was capitalizing on the new fascination with serial killers. At the point when he was telling about these coastal killings, it was the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and the public was fascinated with Ted Bundy, the Hillside Stranglers, John Wayne Gacy, the Night Stalker. He wanted to be elevated to their ranks, but to also be above their ranks, picking a number he thought no one could beat, saying he'd killed over 100 people.
And he tells utterly horrific tales of using hot lead to torture, as well as acid, lighters, hammers, hatchets, awls, and cables, sodomizing victims with his Arkansas toothpick, and famously saying he cut a woman's nipple off and forced her to eat it, which has been recreated in horror movies and splatterpunk books. The level of depravity he describes is unimaginable.
I slid the point of the knife into her ass and real slow pushed all 11 inches of the toothpick blade inside her, all the way up to the hilt, and I sliced upward as I pulled out. Where she had 2 little holes, now she had one big one. Some I cut, some I burned. I ran a cable in and out of one and hung her up by it. I pumped another one full of water, which seemed to really hurt, filling her up until it came out her nose and mouth.
He claims he had to kill a random stranger every month or else suffer terrible headaches and anxiety. These killings are most certainly lies, but still, we have to wonder why he told them. Obviously, it was a tool of manipulation of some sort, describing himself to Jim Beaty as a man who only killed those who deserved it, and had never raped anyone in his long criminal career, but telling Wilton Earl that he was America's most vicious serial killer.
They say serial killers begin with a fantasy. They fantasize and fantasize and fantasize about rape and murder and torture, and eventually try to make those fantasies a reality. And I think here we can see those fantasies at play. Fantasies of being a suave and smooth killer, like something out of a Thomas Harris book or slasher movie, going undetected as he roamed the highways, seeking out miscreants and wayward hippies. But the truth was, he was just a pint-sized little punk who raped defenseless children.
Chapter 5: The Serious Murders. Then Pee Wee Gaskins says he began his serious murders, most of which are believed to be very, very real. While often these so-called serious murders were over money and were, as he would say, just business, as he explained them to Jim Beaty, saying that he never killed anyone who didn't need killing, the truth is many of them were pointless sex crimes. The only thing that really separates what he called his serious murders from his coastal killings is the fact that he knew the victims in his serious murders, and that the coastal killings are most certainly complete fabrications.
Yeah, far from these serious murders all being about business or a code of honor, the very first were disgusting and vile sex crimes committed against his own family. He abducted his own niece, Janice, his sister's daughter, only 15, and her friend, Patricia Alsbrook. He raped them, beat them, literally beating his own niece to death, and knocking Patricia unconscious and dumping her into the sludge of a septic tank, still alive, putting the heavy concrete lid back on, sealing her in the filth and darkness to literally drown in shit, and then burying his niece, Janice, behind a barn by his childhood home.
Pee Wee had been seen with the girls and was questioned by the sheriff, but he claimed they ran away to California, and that was that, adding to the incredibly long list of murdered teens in the 1970s whose deaths were never investigated because it was said they were runaways.
Later, confessing to his crimes as a means of escaping the electric chair, he'd lead investigators to the septic tank, and they'd find the skeletized remains of Patricia Alsbrook there, confirming that this horrible and senseless act he describes was very, very true. And if you see photos of these young girls, they were so pretty, with such a bright light in their eyes, it's utterly heartbreaking. He was a total monster, an absolute piece of shit who had no code of honor whatsoever. And that is the final truth.
On New Year's Day, 1971, he was married again, and soon had a son, Donald Gaskins Jr. Pee Wee found work as a mechanic at Kolb's Used Cars, where a wild African-American lesbian woman named Martha Ann Dix would hang out at the car lot. She was quite the character, dressed like a man and called herself Clyde, and Pee Wee says she was, quote, funny and real and entertaining, end quote, and that he liked her.
Now, Pee Wee told Mr. Jim Beaty, that he killed her because she was a black woman who had the audacity to joke that he'd slept with her. She'd broken his racist code. And he also says this in courtroom testimony. But in final truth, Pee Wee says, I don't want anybody to get the idea it was any kind of prejudice that led me to murder Clyde. I didn't kill her because she was black. I never killed nobody because of their race. I admit I growed up in a part of the state notable for the Ku Klux Klan, And I have been to some Klan rallies, but I have never killed anybody just because they were black. I killed Clyde because she was a goddamn loudmouth liar who made the mistake of telling her lies about me and thinking they was funny. Two things a sworn fact. I'm not prejudiced against no particular race, creed, or color. And I never in my whole life put my dick in no black pussy. And that's the final truth.
The blatant hypocrisy of this paradoxical statement is incredible and really proves the point that there is no truth to Pee Wee Gaskins, just lies and murder.
By now, Pee Wee has a full-on thievery ring, buying and selling stolen guns and cars, doing his stealing dealings with all his carny and jailhouse associates. When a man named Eddie Brown brought the heat, he killed him and his wife, Bertie, just business, like he'd explained to Mr. Jim, burying them in what would become his personal graveyard.
He moved about and was doing tree work for a stock car driver when he found a purple Cadillac hearse for sale. He loved that hearse and bought it straight up, hanging a sign in the back that said, "We haul anything, living or dead," and hung a rubber skeleton from the rearview mirror. Man, I feel like I should have a purple hearse. That would be a very me car. He became famous for driving this hearse about. People would ask, "Hey, Pee Wee, why are you driving a hearse?" And he'd say,
I need a hearse to haul bodies to my private cemetery.
and saying in his book, Final Truth,
I got more ass in the back of that hearse than in any vehicle I ever owned. Fucking a stone cold killer in the back of a hearse truly turned on them women who like the smell of violence and death.
Then came Doreen Dempsey, the former girlfriend of his buddy Johnny Sellers. Her family worked with the carnival and lived in Sumter. She was a wild child, had a little girl named Robin Michelle, just 2 years old, and after getting pregnant again, was on the outs with her family. So she moved in with Pee Wee to help with the housework and chores. Pee Wee testified in court and told Jim Beaty that he drowned her in his pond because both her daughter and unborn child were fathered by African-American men, saying race mixing went against his racist code, and she therefore had to die. But he tells a much different story in Final Truth. I don't know. Do you think people are gonna be like, freak out? That might be the worst.
Quote.
Right.
It's
All
a
right.
book. You can buy the book on Amazon.
All right, let's actually, thank you. That's where I'm going to direct my.
I could try to edit it out. I don't know.
I mean, I'm not the. What am I trying to say? I'm not clamoring for censorship here. I just feel like people are gonna wish they hadn't heard that.
Oh, fuck. Okay, here it is. Extreme trigger warning. This is incredibly disturbing. One night, according to Final Truth, Pee Wee took her and her daughter out in his hearse. He parked in the dark forest with the crickets chirping and commenced to start kissing Doreen, which he says was awkward in the car because she was 7 months pregnant. Then he took a hammer and cracked her in the head with it, knocking her unconscious and slit her throat. He then took her 2-year-old infant, stripped her naked, and in his own words, lifted her up and slid her down onto me, which made her scream real loud, so I gagged her with her panties and duct tape. It was like something overpowering was pushing into that little thing. I couldn't stop. I choked her to death when I come in her ass. It was the best and most poweringest cum I ever felt. I fucking warned him a million times.
All right, fair enough. Apologies to people who wish they hadn't heard that. Neither Matt nor I wanted to hear it or say it, but we warned you, and it is in the book, and we felt like, since we've relayed a lot of the lies that Pee Wee said, unfortunately, we had to include this because, really terrifyingly, in this book of so many lies, this most disturbing act is probably one of the most likely to be true.
And why admit it? Why tell Jim Beaty that he killed her because she repeatedly got pregnant by black men, and then change his story and say he killed them during the most disgusting sex crime possibly imaginable? I mean, I don't get it. Is raping an infant and strangling it to death really less offensive than racism? I truly do not understand.
In Final Truth, Pee Wee says this about this awful, despicable crime.
Most men won't never even allow themselves to find out what it's like to even just simply kill, much less to random torture and rape and murder. They can't never know what I know, that getting the guts and balls to do the first one just to pleasure yourself is the onlyest difficult part. Once you've done the first and come to know that real special feeling, you can't hardly wait until another better idea come and leads and pulls and pushes you into what takes you up to another place even higher than you ever been before.
And there were many more of these serious killings, all true. Like Johnny Sellers and his girlfriend Jessie. Johnny was a part of the stealing dealings. Pee Wee saying,
Johnny was the best and fastest car and boat truck booster hot wirer I ever saw. But Johnny had to be watched real close when it come to money. Given half a chance, he would walk away with more than his share every time. Johnny owed me just over $1,000 for strip parts he had got from me and sold but never paid me, which leads me straight to the night I murdered Jessie Ruth and him.
He describes the killings in Final Truth in the same way he told them to James Beaty. Shooting Johnny with his .30-30 and stabbing Jessie with his knife. Again, telling James Beaty and testifying in court that it was his Campbell's soup knife, but saying in Final Truth it was his hand-forged Arkansas toothpick. It seems like even when there's the truth, there's these shadows of lies around them.
And then there was the murder for hire of Silas Barnwell Yates by his former girlfriend, Suzanne Kipper. Just business. Pee Wee was paid $1,500 to do the killing. Forensics determined Yates' throat had been cut, but Pee Wee claims he accomplished the murder with a karate chop to the neck. He also claims in Final Truth that afterwards he was able to blackmail Suzanne into being his personal sex slave. A little fact he neglected to tell James Beaty, if it's even true at all.
And this murder for hire would lead to 2 more deaths, that of Diane Neely and Avery Howard. Diane, the ex-wife of Pee Wee's good friend Walter, had assisted in the murder of Silas Barnwell, coaxing him out of his trailer, and now she was jawing to her boyfriend Avery about it and demanding money to stay quiet. A very stupid move to pull on a man like Pee Wee Gaskins, who dug a grave deep enough for 2, and then told the couple, "Sure, I'll pay you. Come meet me in the forest where I keep my money in a safe hidden in a hollow oak tree." They apparently didn't think it odd that he kept his money in a safe in a tree, and he led them right to that pre-dug grave, and soon they were both inside it, each shot in the head with Pee Wee's beloved Beretta, a gun he loved so much he engraved his name into it. But again, just business. They was jawing and a scheming, and I had to go.
In June of 1975, Pee Wee Gaskins married his 6th wife, only 18. In his autobiography, Pee Wee doesn't even bother saying her name, And the new marriage didn't stop him from preying on other young girls, like 13-year-old Kimberly Gilkins, a friend of the family who actually called him Uncle Pee Wee. He worked on grooming her, molesting her, finally getting her alone, where he, quote, burned and cut and plugged her with molten lead, sliced and carved her, and I ran the toothpick deep inside and twisted it. The sounds of her screams were more pleasuring than I had imagined. She was real sweet to live so long. It was like she knew that the longer she waited to die, the more pleasuring she would give to her Uncle Pee Wee. I kissed her and I thanked her for the greatest joy, then choked her to death and cornholed her again. I buried Kim that evening near Roper's Crossroads. She were different and real special.
This from a man who told Professor James Beaty part of his code was to never even curse or drink in front of a child.
It's so fucking awful, so terrible, and like, unlike his quote-unquote coastal killings, which he obviously made up for shock value, this little girl's death was very, very real, and they'd later find her body in a shallow grave right by those crossroads, exactly where he said it would be.
Chapter 6. The Fall. In the end, Pee Wee's downfall would come from two people: a kind and concerned elementary school teacher and a mentally defective ex-con named Walter Neely.
Pee Wee had met Walter in prison, and on the outside, they worked together roofing and engaged in auto theft. Their stealing dealings. They were tight, even though Pee Wee had killed Walter's ex-wife Diane when she started jawing about the murder of Yates. But what's a little murder between old friends? And when Pee Wee suspected half-brothers Dennis Bellamy and John Henry Knight of robbing him, he used Walter Neely to lure them to his trailer, where he shot them.
Kim Gilkins, like many of the victims Pee Wee preyed on, was an impoverished young girl from a very downtrodden and poor family, a fact he exploited, thinking no one would miss her much or come looking for her. And he was right, no one did, except her 5th grade teacher. When Kim didn't return to school, it was her teacher who went to the police and reported her missing, and her teacher was the one who pressured the police to try to find the young girl. And without that kind teacher, Pee Wee Gaskins would have most likely gone on to kill and rape again.
When police learned Kim had last been seen with Pee Wee, they went to his trailer and searched it, finding clothing belonging to the 13-year-old. But while Pee Wee was gone, having been tipped off that the law was looking for him, Walter Neely was there. And Walter broke down and started jawing, telling them all about the murders of Dennis Bellamy and John Henry Knight, and telling them that Pee Wee did, in fact, have his own private graveyard.
Again, we are faced with uncertain truths. For in documentaries and books about this subject, it sounds like Walter quickly began talking to investigators. But according to Pee Wee, Walter stuck to the code and told the cops nothing, kept his mouth shut. But then the mentally challenged man with an IQ of 76 started seeing ghosts, visions of his ex-wife and the others that had been killed. And plagued by specters, haunted and guilt-ridden, he went to a preacher who convinced him to talk to police.
I'm seeing one of those Southern Pentecostal preachers that handles rattlesnakes. You know, that would be a cool story. A murderer haunted by ghosts going to see a Southern preacher wrapped in rattlesnakes. But who knows? This story, the whole thing could just be bullshit. But I love a ghost story. So it's a good one. And fuck, Pee Wee could spin a yarn. He was a storyteller.
Yeah, that's for sure. And Pee Wee, who through his underground network of cronies, knew the law was on his tail. He headed off for a life on the run, but before he could get far, the sheriff tracked him down. In his car was a cardboard box with the .30-30 rifle he'd shot Johnny Sellers with and the .32 Beretta semi-automatic pistol that he'd actually engraved his name into. Like, what the fuck kind of master criminal writes his name on a murder weapon? Fucking idiot.
And trying to sound like a brilliant outlaw, Pee Wee claims in Final Truth that he was able to covertly mail off his Arkansas toothpick, and it was never discovered. But if you read the trial transcripts, the knife was right there in evidence.
And then Walter Neely was taking an army of law enforcement officers to Pee Wee's private graveyard. As they walked through the heavily wooded area, one officer tugged on a small bush, and it came right up out of the ground. There were no roots. It had been cut at the base and jammed into the ground. As they looked around, they started noticing more and more of these planted bushes, obviously placed there to conceal what was below them. So they started digging and quickly found a body, then another and another and another. By the end of the day, they'd discovered 6 bodies buried there. Dennis Bellamy, John Henry Knight, Diane Neely, Avery Howard, Jesse Judy, and Johnny Sellers.
The body of Dennis Bellamy still had bullets in the brain matter of the skull. They were recovered, and ballistics testings positively matched them to the Beretta Pee Wee had written his name on, sealing his doom.
Walter Neely then led investigators to another area called Alligator Landing, where Doreen Dempsey was found in a hole, wrapped in plastic, with sawdust dumped on top of her, and her daughter Robin was found in a tree stump. Pee Wee would say,
"If bodies don't get found, killers don't get caught." But in December of 1975, the coroner had the bodies, and Jesus had Walter, and the law had me. So there must be like an autopsy report on Doreen Dempsey and her daughter Robin that can confirm cause of death. I tried to find one, but we're not investigators, we're just storytellers. So I didn't fly to South Carolina and start combing through dusty records from 1975, trying to see if a 2-year-old had water in her lungs, proving she'd been drowned and not strangled to death. And sadly, whether her body showed signs of sexual assault or not, it's gonna have to remain a mystery for the moment.
On a remote piece of land by a trailer Pee Wee had lived in with one of his many wives, they found the body of Kim. And on the other side of a field, there investigators uncovered the body of Barnell Yates.
Both Pee Wee and Walter were charged with 8 counts of murder, but in a brilliant move, the prosecution decided to try Pee Wee separately and alone for the murder of Dennis Bellamy because of those bullets that had been found in his head.
In May of 1976, Pee Wee went to trial for the murder of Dennis Bellamy. The ballistic evidence and the gun with his initials on it, really overwhelming evidence, and the trial only lasted for 4 days.
And during the trial, well, so much for honor and truth, as Pee Wee tried to pin it all on Walter Neely. If Pee Wee Gaskins was the redneck Charlie Manson, wouldn't Walter Neely be the Tex Watson who had done the actual killing?
But the jury didn't fall for Pee Wee's devious lies, and on May 28, 1976, Pee Wee Gaskins was found guilty of first-degree murder, which carried an automatic death penalty in South Carolina. And Pee Wee Gaskins was sentenced to death in the electric chair.
But then his sentence was commuted to life in prison when the Supreme Court ruled all death penalty cases must have a separate sentencing hearing, and any death penalty given automatically could not stand.
Pee Wee says,
"Suddenly I was off death row and back on the yard in tears of CCI with my reputation powerfuler than ever, because now I was a nickname with 2 murders to his credit, 7 more indictments hanging over him. I was downright famous. Men came out their way in the yard to shake my hand or to ask me to pose for pictures. Even the warden showed me respect. But I still made it a special point to keep on my goodest behavior. And by end of the year 1977, I was pretty much back in charge of things. I had the system working for me, or as we said inside, I had shit on my dick and blood on my shank. I had my power and my weapon and all the young meat I wanted.
But there were still 8 more murder indictments against him, each with the possibility of death. But he's escaped death for each of them, pleading guilty to avoid the electric chair and receiving 9 life sentences altogether. As Pee Wee says,
I was ready to take all the life sentences they wanted to give me, just as long as they kept me out of that chair.
But as part of his plea deals, Pee Wee had to give full confessions to each of the crimes and answer any question asked of him by law enforcement, all under oath. These are the transcripts we use today to compare to his later autobiography, Final Truth. And as we've shown, they're much different stories. Interestingly, he also had to be questioned with a lie detector and under sodium amytal, a barbiturate thought to be a truth serum, in a hospital for 3 days.
And then Pee Wee set to living his life in cell block 2 of CCI, gradually working his way up the hierarchy of convicts, all the way to the position of building trustee. Because he was so good at fixing things, he was put in charge of maintenance, often working in death row.
Some fancy college professor came around wanting to write a book. A prim and proper, God-fearing Christian named James Beaty. He told the guy what he thought he wanted to hear, played him like a violin, gave him a sob story. It was an amusing way to pass the time, and maybe it would get him some sympathy.
Then he was asked to kill Rudolph Tyner, a black man who'd murdered a white couple. It was an impossible job. Death row prisoners were kept in solitary, under strict watch by guards, and there was no way to get to them.
But Pee Wee made it happen. Using the trust he gained from Professor James Beaty, he conned him into sending him 50 feet of cable and had C4 explosives smuggled in, a tiny bit at a time, hidden in the heels of shoes until he'd amassed a baseball-sized chunk of the stuff. And then he managed to blow that man's head to smithereens.
But very interestingly, when Pee Wee describes this event in Final Truth, he claims that the wire was smuggled to him, curled up in the cones of a speaker in a large tape player. Even in the end, in his Final Truth, he never did implicate James Beaty. Old Mr. Jim. Why? Was it the code he followed? Or did he actually feel affection for Mr. Jim, see him as a friend?
You'd almost think he'd be proud of conning this college professor into mailing him parts for a bomb. Well, that's a pretty slick move.
It was. Pee Wee had escaped the electric chair twice through both luck and cunning. But as they say, the third time's the charm. There was no worming his way out this time. He was dragged back to the courtroom, put on trial, and quickly sentenced to death in the electric chair. Interestingly, he would be the first white man in South Carolina history to receive the death penalty for killing a black man.
Then it was back to CCI to await his date with Old Sparky, the electric chair first used in the state in 1912, a wood and steel contraption that resembled a barber's chair, with an upholstered leather back and leather straps hanging off of it, steel stirrups to bind the feet, and that had ended the life of 248 condemned prisoners. It's an intimidating and creepy-looking device, so we'll post a picture.
But prison wouldn't be like it had been before. Nope. He'd embarrassed the whole institution, the warden, the guards, everyone, giving CCI the reputation as the only death row in America where an inmate could be murdered while being held in a high-security, solitary confinement cell. So Pee Wee was sent off to the worst dungeon they had, the maximum security isolation unit, a basement cell that was called Cuba, a place isolated from everything and everyone, in isolation of the prison itself. Nothing to see, nothing to hear. He was given no pillow, no sheets, just one rough blanket.
But in 1986, the maximum security unit building was condemned and closed down as being unsafe and unfit for human occupancy, and all of death row was moved to the Broad River Correctional Institution. Here he could communicate with other prisoners, was given phone privileges, put in a cell where he could see and hear other living human beings and receive visitors, and actually be with them, touch them, hug them, hang out in a nice carpeted area with a microwave and vending machines. But as Pee Wee would say,
the only problem is, when they moved all us condemned inmates to this new facility, they brought along the same old electric chair.
Then in May of 1990, Pee Wee Gaskins began meeting with Wilton Earl and narrating his final truth, a bizarre story full of contradictions, perverse to the extreme, and claiming to have murdered 90 more people.
So why did Pee Wee claim to have killed so many more people? Was it to immortalize himself? Attach his zeitgeist to that of the iconic American serial killer image? Yeah, probably. But there was more to it than that. By claiming to know where more bodies were, he was actually given the chance to leave the prison to take investigators to supposed crime scenes. Henry Lee Lucas, often called the confession killer, used the same ploy. Getting out, getting some fresh air, investigators often buying him lunch and always giving him as much coffee and cigarettes as he wanted.
But there was a catch with Pee Wee. There was always a catch with Pee Wee. He thought he might be able to escape. He'd walk with this really pronounced limp, hamming it up, dragging his foot. You can see it in videos as he's let out, but it was a ruse. He was quick as a jackrabbit and would bolt if given half a chance.
And once, while out looking for supposed burial sites, investigators noticed a white van circling the area, slowing down to studying them, taking off to only reappear. Investigators closed in on Pee Wee and drew their guns. He'd later admit it was some of his Carney family looking to bust him free. Remember, he was known as the redneck Charlie Manson.
And at one point, Pee Wee's son Donald Jr. even hatched a plan to kidnap the solicitor's daughter and to ransom her off for Pee Wee's release. Which, crazy as it sounds, could have worked. The solicitor is free to call convicts to his office, even death row inmates, and he actually had a back door. Strangely, no one knew about this back door, but Pee Wee somehow did. Luckily, someone did some jawing, and the plan was discovered and nipped in the bud.
And perhaps plotting and scheming, imagining, living out these fake crimes in his head, slowly going mad, stuck there in his cell on death row. These web of lies took over his mind, so that when he dictated his autobiography, he even believed it, convinced himself that he was an unstoppable killing machine, suave and sophisticated enough to travel the highways undetected, snuffing out the lives of beautiful hippie hitchhikers, when the truth was he was a child killer, a pedophile, a rapist, an arsonist, a petty thief and two-bit punk who preyed on the poor and the downtrodden. The final truth is, there is no truth with Pee Wee Gaskins, just a web of lies.
Just before the date of his execution, Pee Wee gagged up a razor blade he'd hidden in his throat and slit his wrists, requiring 20 stitches. Had he really planned on taking his own life? Was it some kind of act? One last piece of showmanship? One last lie in his final truth? We'll never know, for the state of South Carolina executed Donald Pee Wee Gaskins at 1:04 a.m. on Friday, September 6th, 1991. He walked in unassisted and sat down without hesitation. His last words before the black hood was put over his head were,
"I'm ready to go."
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the final truth.
Woo, man, that was fucking tough. Holy shit, man.
Yeah, he's the fucking pits. He's the worst.
Yeah.
But the sad part is he's not even the worst. It's like, oh, I think the Albert Fish letter is the worst for me of all that we've covered. And then like little pieces of others that have stuck in my head. The torture trailers. Who had the torture trailers?
Oh,
the toolbox killer. The toy box killer, yeah. That sticks in my head.
The toolbox killers were different ones. They were fucked up too. Lawrence Whitaker. Maybe we'll do them one day. I don't know. I'm ready for something creepy. Actually, we're gonna do a play next week. I'm writing. I'm writing a play for us.
Is it like based on a true crime?
It sure is.
Sweet.
It's based on Milwaukee's most famous cannibal.
Who do I get to play?
I don't know. Let's talk about it. We'll figure it out.
Okay.
I was thinking you'd be the investigator and I'd be the killer because it's an investigation. But we could switch it up if you'd like.
Yeah, well, send it to me when it's done, and I'll take a look at it.
Sounds good.
For now, I need to go get my child off the television.
All right, everybody.
Glad we got it done. Thanks for being flexible as always.
And thanks so much for listening, guys. Whew, that was fucking doozy. You want to talk to us? Send us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. I'm gonna go take a shower. I feel disgusting.
Yeah,
Bye.
for sure.